Good evening. Tonight, let me tell you how and why the British deliberately misled the communists and maneuvered their open front workers into a false position. In the Legislative Assembly meeting of July the 20th, I recounted how Lim Chin Siong and his friends had been taken for a ride by the British over a period of several months at lunches, cocktail parties, dinner parties, and other social occasions. The UK Commission officials dropped hints to Lim Chin Siong and his friends, and even generally to businessmen and sharebrokers, both local and British sharebrokers, giving everyone the impression that they considered Lim and his friends reasonable and sensible people. Slowly, Lim and his friends were led to believe that if they were to obtain power by constitutional means, so long as the military bases were left untouched, the British would be quite happy to let them run this island. Lim was putting on his best act. He was pretending to Lord Selkirk and his officials that he and his friends like Fong Swee Swan were just like To Chin Chai and myself. They were also PAP non-communist socialists, only that they were in the more radical wing of the PAP. Selkirk and his officials had no doubts whatsoever that Lim was the most important open front communist leader, but they pretended to believe Lim's act, that he was a genuine non-communist socialist. And the British went out of their way to be nice to Lim and his friends, encouraging them to believe that there was no constitutional difficulty to their taking over the present government or forming the next one. On the other hand, the British pressed us, the Singapore government, to curb and contain the subversive activities of Lim and his friends. We were therefore puzzled when we found that Lim and his friends were absolutely confident that they could take over and run the government. We could not understand how they came to believe this, when on the other hand we were being pressed to take action against them. It was only after the Anson by-election, 2 days before the motion of confidence in the Assembly, when we found that Lim Chin Siong and his friends were in conference with the UK Commissioner at Eden Hall, did it dawn on us that this was a deep ruse which had been going on for some time. So long as Lim and his friends believed that they could not assume power without getting into trouble, they would play it quietly and not give trouble to the Singapore government, particularly a PAP left-wing government. So long as they did not attack the Singapore government, the British could not get the government to go out of its way to suppress Lim and his communist friends. So the British led Lim and his communist friends to believe that they could take power. And once they believed this, they became bold. First, they pressed us to change our policy. We refused. And then came the attack by the communists on the PAP. Lim and Fong said they went to tea at Lord Selkirk's residence for social friendliness. Unfortunately, Woodall has later admitted that they went to see Lord Selkirk, in his own words, to clarify the situation. Now, James Putucherry, in a letter to the Straits Times of the 21st August, enlarged further on this. He said, "But it must be a very strange state of affairs, when a great plot is nothing more than the stating of the correct constitutional position. Were the PAP leaders expecting the British to say that constitutional rights were reserved for PAP leaders only? If not, why all this sensationalism? And he said, I am prepared to accept this statement of the constitutional position was in reality a great plot if the PAP leaders could tell me what the British were trying to achieve by it. Well, we can. What the British wanted to achieve was to get the communists to come out into the open on their own, attack the PAP, and be purged in retaliation. Lim Chin Siong, the Communist Open Front leader, was helped by Woodhull and James Putticherry, and also by sympathizers like Francis Wong, the editor of the Sunday Mail. Francis Wong was also testing the ground at the UK Commission, having confidential discussions over lunch with UK Commission officials. By June this year, they all became convinced by the British that constitutional rights were open to them and that they could assume power. The green light had been given. They could outleft the PAP. In this way, they blundered into their conflict with us. The British have more experience in dealing with such delicate situations. Whatever embarrassment our exposure caused them, they have said absolutely nothing, and thereby they have saved themselves further embarrassment. Let me retrace the main events from May this year. When we were defeated in Hong Lim, we wanted to resign. We had lost because there was discontent over unemployment, lack of cheap housing, lack of social welfare benefits, strictness in immigration controls, and the issue of citizenship papers. All these problems can only be solved if we have political certainty and stability, and industrial expansion. Political certainty and stability will encourage investment and bring industrial expansion. With industrial expansion, we can give the people more jobs, cheap housing, more social welfare benefits, unemployment and TB allowances, and so on. We can also allow freer immigration because there will be more jobs. But these economic and social problems cannot be solved until we get merger and common market with the Federation. Merger will bring about political certainty and stability, and common market will provide a bigger market for goods manufactured in Singapore. In other words, a wider economic base for expansion. Then we can begin to solve the people's dissatisfaction. The Federation government had all along been reluctant to agree on common market or on merger. They know that the PAP ministers are sincere Malayan nationalists and sincere in our desire to achieve independence through merger. But they feared that the PAP was giving shelter to the communists like Lim Chin Siong and others, and they were not going to accommodate these communists. We saw no solution to our economic problems after the defeat in Hong Lim, because at that time the Federation were not eager either for merger or for common market. We wanted to resign and have fresh elections rather than carry on without a visible solution to our basic problems. There were cries of protest from the communists and their supporters in the unions, in the cultural associations, and their other open front organizations. they did not want us to resign. Not because it would have been bad for Singapore, but because they feared that if we resigned, they, the communists, would suffer. They feared that there might be no single political party who could win the elections and form the government. In such an event, a coalition government would have to be formed, and such a coalition would eventually be manipulated by the British into an anti-communist front, and the communists would be purged and suppressed. So, from all their quarters, came the cry that the people were behind the PAP, and it was our duty to carry on. You will remember my May Day speech at the Jalan Besar Stadium. I clearly explained that the government was not there just to be made use of by all and sundry, including the communists. We were in office for the purpose of resolving the basic economic and social problems of the people. If we could not do this, then it was our duty to resign. But some time after the Hong Lim by-election, Lim and his friends became confident, as a result of conversations with UK Commission officials, that if we resign, they, the communists, could make a bid for power. So they planned to persuade a majority of the PAP assemblymen not to resign, but to carry on under new ministers, with Dr. Lee Siew Choh as the Prime Minister and Dr. Sheng Nam Chien as the Deputy Prime Minister. They still did not want to face general elections. Instead, they hoped to persuade at least 26 assemblymen to carry on under the same PAP symbol, but with they, the communists, leading Dr. Lee and Dr. Sheng. They started to work feverishly to try and win over as many assemblymen as possible. You will remember, on June the 2nd, Lim Chin Siong issued a statement supporting the PAP in the Anson by-election on condition that we agreed to demand the abolition of the Internal Security Council in the 1963 constitutional talks. This, you will also remember, was exactly the line taken by the Plen. Lim pressed us for our stand. On the 9th of June, Dr. To, chairman of the PAP, announced that the government would demand complete independence through merger with the Federation. Then, on the 12th of June, in an angry statement, they demanded the immediate release of the detainees, immediate implementation of the reunification of trade unions, the granting of citizenship rights to anti-colonialists, in other words, to communists and their supporters who have had their citizenship papers withheld. And they demanded more freedom of speech, freedom of press and organization for the advancement of the anti-colonial struggle. What they mean is the communist struggle. All these demands were made only after we stated our stand on independence through merger in the 1963 constitutional talks, and after we refused to support the communist demand for the abolition of the Internal Security Council. Had we agreed to the communist demand, then the course of history would have been completely different. There would have been no conflict between the PAP and the communists in the open. But we would have agreed to a united front on communist terms for the advancement of the interests of the communists, not for the advancement of the interests of the people. Meanwhile, 2 governors and 1 high commissioner flew in to Singapore from Borneo. The Tunku then went to Brunei for a state visit. Mr. Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, said that the Tunku's Malaysia proposals were striking. Lim Chin Siong and his friends got excited. They believed that we had come to some secret agreement for merger and they would be in a fix. The plenipotentiary of the MCP, whom I have told you about, must have thought that I had lied to him on May the 11th, when in answer to his question whether merger was likely soon, I had said that it was not. That was May the 11th, and I had then believed that early merger was not on the horizon. But the Tunku changed the whole perspective by his speech on Saturday, the 27th of May, to the Foreign Correspondents Association at a luncheon in Singapore, when he then for the first time mooted merger and Malaysia. The Plen must have believed that I had concealed this from him and wanted to take the communists by surprise. The thing they fear most is that security would be in the hands of a pan-Malayan government which they would not be able to intimidate or control. Lim issued fierce statements and threatened us with dire consequences about the anger of the people at our selling out Singapore to the Federation. At that time, there was no agreement, even on principle, with the Federation government on merger. Lim, however, knows that whatever the terms and conditions, if Singapore is merged with the Federation, security must be in the hands of the central government. And he feared that he and his communist supporters would be in trouble. So although there were no terms or conditions then agreed or known, he, in a statement published in the press on the 9th of July, said that they, Lim and his friends, and I quote his exact words, were clear that socialists must ensure that the principle upon which unification of the territories were to be brought about must advance the interests of Malayan socialism. What he meant was merger conditions must advance the interests of the Malayan communists. They were not concerned about the interests of the people. In my next talk, I shall explain this paradox, this contradiction, why the communists prefer a British-controlled Singapore without the Internal Security Council to a Singapore independent together with the rest of Malaya.